The spit hit him right in the face. A wet spot rolled down his cheek, leaving a thin mark on his spotlessly clean glove. The crowd froze. The cameras, which a second ago were filming another joke on the Guardsman, suddenly witnessed something else. Something dangerous. The man in the expensive jacket huffed and looked at his friends. Well, who said they wouldn't react? But no one answered. The Guardsman stood as he had been for the last 3 hours, as unmoved as a stone statue in front of a palace. But something changed. Silence rolled in, thick as a storm cloud. The tourists involuntarily stepped back. The woman whispered to her husband, "This will end badly." The Guardsman slowly, without haste, raised his hand and wiped away the spittle. And then, for the first time that day, he took a step forward. And the whole crowd felt it with him, the moment when the line was crossed. The square in front of Buckingham Palace was bustling with tourists. Children were laughing. Men in shirts with rolled-up sleeves were taking pictures of their wives against the backdrop of majestic architecture. The Guardsmen, as always, stood motionless, as if they were part of the palace itself. James Holloway had been at his post for 3 hours. The 29-year-old Guard sergeant, a veteran of 2 combat missions, was now on duty here in the heart of London. His uniform was impeccable, a red uniform without a single wrinkle, buttons that glistened in the sun, and a massive bear hat that made him look like a living symbol of British greatness. He was ready for anything. Well, almost. A group of young men-Americans, judging by their accents, had been hanging around for several minutes. They were drunk, joking loudly, and filming videos for social media. One of them, wearing a dark blue jacket, was clearly the leader. "They say they never react," he proclaimed, smiling. "Think I can move it?" "Come on, dude," his friends encouraged, laughing. At first, everything was standard. Posing for photos, waving their hands at James' face, making stupid jokes. He remained unfazed, as expected. But then the stranger took a step closer. "Hey, kid, what are you guarding here anyway?" His voice was defiant, challenging. James didn't blink, didn't move. The man leaned even closer, his breath smelling like whiskey. "Watch this, boys. He's about to break." And he spat. Thin, sticky saliva hit his cheek, trickling down. Silence. The tourists gasped, and several people instinctively backed away. Only the sound of cars in the distance could be heard. James did not move. The man squared his shoulders, enjoying the moment. But a second later he turned pale. The guard made the first move. Slowly, he raised his hand. The white glove wiped away the spittle. Then he lowered it. Another movement. He stepped forward. The people behind him instinctively stepped back, even though he hadn't done anything threatening. The man in the jacket was no longer smiling. His friends looked at him nervously. James looked up. His eyes met the offender's. And that was enough. Something invisible but powerful changed the atmosphere. And everyone realized that the real reaction was yet to come. The wind ran through the square, shifting the fallen leaves. But no one noticed. All eyes were on 2 men, an unruffled guardsman and a tourist who was laughing a second ago, but now felt something in the air change. James Holloway took another step forward. The man in the navy blue jacket stirred. It was as if he had woken up from a silly game he had started. Something in the guardsman's eyes made his heart skip a beat. Not anger, not rage. No, it was worse. There was only cold emptiness in those eyes. Real discipline. "Okay, dude, relax," one of the tourist friends muttered, backing away. But James didn't look at them. His body remained as tense as a string. Every muscle remembered his army training. Every cell remembered the time when he stood under fire, waiting for an order, not having the right to flinch. But now was different. A crowd gathered around him. Someone was already broadcasting live, commenting on the event in a whisper. "He's moving. Dude, the guardsman is moving forward. This is something new. What's he going to do?" The tourists felt that the air had become heavy. People were watching, waiting for him to get out of the situation. He forced the man to break the peace. He had spat in his face. And now he had to realize that not all jokes are just jokes. "Listen," he opened his lips, but no words came out. James remained silent. He only slowly stretched out his hand and took off his white glove. The crowd froze again. What did this mean? A punishment? An answer? A few people in the crowd knew what it meant. When a guard takes off his glove, it's a signal. In a few seconds, more guards would appear on the square. And then the joke would end forever. The man in the jacket felt a cold sweat running down his back. His friends moved even further away. No one wanted to be around when the palace guards intervened. But the worst was yet to come, because James smiled. Barely noticeable, barely perceptible, but he smiled. And it was more frightening than any threat. What would happen next? Something in the guardsman's subtle smile made the man in the jacket stagger backward. It was not joy. It was not anger. It was something deeper, a silent realization that an invisible line had been crossed, and now the clock was counting down the seconds to reckoning. The wind blew the first dry leaves, swirling them between people's legs, but the crowd remained motionless. James Holloway stood in front of the tourist, slowly squeezing a white glove in his hand. He didn't look away, didn't make any unnecessary movements, but his whole posture, straight, menacing in its impeccable discipline, said one thing. Everyone would remember this moment. The man in the jacket, who had been confident in his power just a few minutes ago, suddenly realized that control was slipping from his hands. "That's enough, Kevin," one of his friends said quietly, and for the first time, he sounded afraid. Kevin. The name sounded like a sentence in the silence. He licked his lips. His throat was dry. Okay. Kevin held up his hands, backing away another step. It was just a joke. Okay? But it wasn't a joke anymore. Heavy footsteps, honed by years of training, came from behind James. 3 more guardsmen stepped out of the shadows of the palace, heading toward them. Black bear hats, red uniforms, they walked without any haste. But everyone in the crowd realized that this slowness only made the moment even more unbearable. Tourist whispered. Someone turned off the recording, as if afraid to witness what would happen next. Kevin looked around for support, but his friends were no longer there. They had retreated into the crowd, pretending they had nothing to do with him. "Shit," he whispered. His back rested against the cold metal fence that separated the crowd from the main entrance. There was nowhere else to retreat, and James took another half-step closer. He stopped, and he said the only phrase that eventually sounded louder than any shouting. "Get on your knees." Kevin took a sharp breath. His heart was pounding. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't part of the plan. This was not part of a stupid drunken joke. But those who had served, those who understood the essence of discipline, knew that if a guard spoke, it was over. 2 seconds of silence seemed like an eternity. The crowd watched without taking their eyes off. And then something happened that no one expected. Kevin, trembling, really started to go down. Kevin felt his legs getting weaker. He didn't want it. He wasn't going to obey, but something in the guardsman's steady gaze was breaking him from the inside. "What are you doing? Get up," someone from the crowd shouted, but it was useless. His knees touched the cold stone. The crowd gasped in shock. The tourists who had just watched an ordinary prank a second ago were now seeing something more. It was not just a scene between a guardsman and an impudent tourist. It was a moment of absolute superiority. James Holloway did not budge. There was deafening silence around him. The wind ruffled his bearskin hat, but the guardsman remained motionless, as if he were the embodiment of discipline itself. Kevin was trembling. An overwhelming shame washed over him. His friends looked away, avoiding eye contact. Those who had supported him 10 minutes earlier now pretended not to know him at all. "Get up, boy," a calm but authoritative voice said. It was one of the guard's officers. He stood aside, watching everything from the beginning. Next to him were 2 policemen. Kevin looked up. His eyes were full of panicked fear. This was a misunderstanding. His voice was hoarse, weak, nothing like the confident tone he had used moments earlier. The policeman did not answer. One of them took out his handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent," they said in an official tone. Kevin shook his head. He couldn't believe this was happening. "Guys," he looked around for support. But his friends were gone. The crowd started filming again. No laughing, no commenting, just filming. James Holloway, without moving, watched another illusion crumble before him. The illusion that one could be above honor, discipline, and tradition. Kevin sat down on the ground without resisting. He had lost. As he was lifted to his feet and led away, someone in the crowd whispered, "His face will be remembered by the whole country." But the real symbol of what had happened stood motionless, returning to his original position. The guard. Others can change. He did not. Kevin was led through the crowd. His hands were cuffed behind his back, the handcuffs digging coldly into his skin. His face was pale, his lips were pursed, his eyes darted around, looking for a way out. But there was no way out. Every step sounded louder than it should have. His new leather shoes slipped on the cobblestones as if he no longer had control of his own body. 10 minutes ago, He was the main character in his own show. Now he was just an embarrassment, captured by hundreds of phones. His friends turned away. They did not try to help. They didn't even look in his direction. "Watch out, buddy," one of the policemen said quietly as they passed the crowd. "You have no idea what's coming for you." Kevin grimaced. It was just a joke, wasn't it? The crowd parted in silence. Most of them weren't filming anymore. They were just watching. People of all ages and nationalities. Children were clutching their parents' hands. Some even looked worried. No, it was something else. A fascination. Not for him. For the Guardsman. James Holloway stood where he had been since the beginning. His uniform remained spotless. He did not straighten his uniform, did not wipe away the spit. There was no need. He had already won. But as the police led Kevin away, something unexpected happened. James heard a muffled sound erupt in the crowd. A pop. 1, 2, 3. People began to clap. At first, timidly, just a few pairs of hands. But then louder. Louder. A wave of applause swept across the square, filling the cold autumn air. James didn't move. He could not respond, could not think. But he heard. And most importantly, Kevin heard. His head jerked back, and he saw it. People who were not just supporting the Guardsman. They admired him. Kevin took a sharp breath. His chest tightened. A wave of hot, suffocating rage swept through his body. "Are you serious?" he shouted, jerking in the hands of the police. "All of you. This is just a show. You fell for it like a herd of sheep." But no one listened to him. His words were lost in the applause. James remained motionless. But he knew it was over. The police dragged Kevin into the car. The door slammed shut. And then, when it seemed like the end was in sight, Kevin made one last mistake. He hissed like a snake, craning his neck, trying to catch James' gaze once again. "You're not a hero," he exhaled, his voice breaking with anger. "You're just a puppet in this game." And then for the first time that day, James did something unexpected. He lowered his eyes. And Kevin saw it. A thin, subtle smile. His stomach clenched. The patrol car door closed. And suddenly he realized he hadn't just lost. He had become part of a legend. The end.